welcome to our April webinar as part of our 2025 Resilience by Design learning series. Today we're going to be talking about increasing the resilience of your operations by implementing a systems approach to managing risk. I am your speaker today, Linda Nelson. I am the founder and president of ICOR, and I sit on several technical committees working on resilience, whether it's looking at it from operations side, like business continuity and crisis management, or more on the holistic side of organizational resilience and community resilience. We are running this year a Resilience by Design learning series that it is offered monthly and on demand. So if you haven't attended our February or March webinars, you can view those on our website as well as on YouTube, and just send us an email that you've attended, and you can get credit towards your Resilience by Design learning badge. In February, we talked about how to determine the context of your resilience strategy. In March, we looked at Agile and this idea that your whole organization needs to be operating in an agile and flexible manner in order for resilience, those behaviors really for them to work and enable that to happen. Today, as I said, we're going to be talking about implementing a systems approach to managing risk. Next month, we have a guest speaker who's going to be talking about understanding the global impact of DORA. In June, we're going to look specifically at your crisis management and communications capability. In July, your business continuity. In August, your IT systems, including your data center operations. In September, we're going to move to your supply and value chains. October, looking at our security systems. And in November, something that we haven't talked about before is the impact of geopolitical risk of your operations. I actually was participating in a conference last fall for a conference that was in Australia, and this was back in October of 2024 was the #1 risk that leaders of large organizations globally were concerned about, and that has actually moved to a vibrant red, given all the changes of things that have been happening in the US more recently. But today we're going to focus on that systems approach to managing risk. We're going to start by looking at some models and frameworks where you can understand the role of preparedness and managing risk within the overall framework of organizational resilience. I'm going to talk about the importance of integration and reducing those silos or stovepipes. We're going to give you an example of how you might use a systems approach by looking at incident management or incident response in particular. And then finishing up with just a short brief on risk culture and how that impacts how you implement that systems approach to managing risk. The recording should be available by the end of this week. It'll also be posted on YouTube. Just remember that if you have questions, use the questions button. We will have polls with this webinar, so I will try to address any questions that you have during the poll. So feel free to ask those questions during the webinar. And you need to attend at least 35 minutes to get that certificate of attendance. So what are we trying to learn today? And those of you that are here and involved in managing risk of some kind, a resilience outcome is that you'll implement systems to ensure that risk is effectively managed throughout the organization. And we use this idea of managing risk versus necessarily using the term risk management, because sometimes that puts us in our own silo, where we really need to understand that risk is managed in all sorts of ways, within and as well as outside of the formal risk management structure that you may have. So we have two models that address preparedness and managing risk specifically. Our organizational resilience model on the left, where we have the preparedness and managing risk piece. And then in our capability assessment, we also include attributes that you would measure and capabilities that you would measure for preparedness and managing risk. When we're looking specifically at the organizational resilience model, you can see we have 3 dimensions: leadership and strategy, culture and behavior, and preparedness and managing risk. We'll be specifically looking at preparedness and managing risk today. But understanding that while every organization is unique and resilience is implemented in a unique way, there are some common attributes and behaviors demonstrated by organizations that have survived and thrived during times of change and uncertainty. And you're going to see me using the words change and uncertainty really until we get to the incident response framework, because it isn't just about managing, natural disasters. It is about managing change and uncertainty as well. And then you'll notice inside the model, we do have the behaviors of adaptive and flexible, resourceful, creative and innovative, inclusive and collaborative, as well as the prepared, robust and redundant, which we'll address specifically during today's webinar as well. So let's drill down a little bit into dimension 3. Our outcome statement, excuse me. It is spring here in Illinois, and my allergies are having a great time today. But we know that organizational resilience is enhanced when the organization intentionally manages risk and prepares for the unexpected. And a key factor of this is that alignment and collaboration of your risk-based systems, which is really fundamental to enhancing your organization's resilience. When we look at the broad scope of preparedness and managing risk, we're looking at having available resources, that you manage risk, and that you manage change. And it's important that your organization anticipates and not just responds to threats and opportunities arising, here we go again, to sudden or gradual changes in its internal or external context. So this would be, you've got change internally or change externally happening to you, and that you try to get in the forefront when we're looking at the preparedness piece is anticipating, and when we're looking at the managing piece, it's more about the responding. And so what you want to have is a capability and a capacity. And I want to talk about that just briefly. The capability is you've got, the processes in place to do that, but do you actually have the capacity? When we look at the fact that organizations keep becoming more, what they might say, efficient, but reducing people, and therefore each of us is being asked to do more. So do you actually have the capacity to fulfill the capabilities that you have? Or do you have the capacity to manage a big change or manage an incident that goes on much longer than you expect, or that is bigger than you expect? And so that's why this idea of capability and capacity they need to both be addressed. And so we need to be able to deliver on your organization's commitments under changing circumstances and be able to adapt its operations to effectively manage risk. And so we need to look at what kinds of strategies can we put in place to increase that competence. We also need to look at sources or different types of risks. There's strategic risk, there's compliance risk, there's operational risk, financial risk, reputational risk, and I'm sure there could be other categories that you'd like to add. Today, we're going to be looking specifically at the category of operational risk. So when we look at how you might manage risk, there's many different, what I'll call, functional areas that you can do that. Obviously, business continuity and crisis management communications are right there. Your critical environments or your data centers, you need to manage risk to those as well. Looking at how you manage risk within your human resources management or your talent management, through all of your technology to make sure it's continuing and you don't just have a disaster recovery plan, but you actually have a plan to continue operations. Looking at incident response, information and cybersecurity, your legal audit and compliance risk, the formal risk management system that you should have, as well as looking at your supply chains. This is our original framework that we developed back in 2006. And what we have done, I think it was 2017, is we updated that to include the fact that when you're looking at organizational resilience, So let me just step back for a second. These 10, I'll call them functional areas or disciplines, tend to be what you would look at under operational resilience. But it's also very, very important that your organization is healthy and viable, and that you behave in your culture and how you operate contributes to the resilience of your organization or not, because sometimes that's to the detriment. And no matter what you're doing with managing risk operationally, if your organization is not financially healthy and it isn't a place where people are engaged and happy and want to work there, that can be undermining as well. In fact, one of the interesting pieces when you look long term is that some of the major companies that have gone out of business have not gone out of business because they were unable to manage an incident or manage a business interruption. Instead, it was because they were not managing change. And so looking at how you manage change within the operational resilience piece is also something that you need to look at. So the question really on the table is, does your organization address each of these systems? And are you addressing them as a whole framework versus as siloed pieces of work or siloed functional areas? So it's time for you to share your thoughts. So within GoToWebinar, we can ask a question, but we can only give you 5 choices. So I have had to combine some of these. So let's go ahead and look at the first one, which is which systems for managing risk are you responsible for? And here I'd like you to choose all that apply. If you're not responsible for managing risk in any of these areas, then just choose none of these. And we'll give you about 30 seconds to do that. And I am sorry, on your end, I do have a typo with the word none there. All right, about 10 more seconds. For those of you that chose none of these, I would love it if you could use the questions button and just go ahead and share what you do represent, because it's always interesting to me to see from what areas are we getting attendees from, participants from as well. So I'm going to go ahead and close this, and it looks like 73% of you, the largest group, is involved with business continuity or supply chain, as well as the incident response and crisis management, which often is part of business continuity as well. And then 40% of you, formally are part of the risk management side of the business too. So very interesting. Thank you. So the question for you to consider is, how are you and your team strengthening your organization so that it can withstand threats of all kinds and come out stronger than ever? Because each of us has a role in doing that, and understanding that role is really important. And so as we look at different strategies for increasing preparedness and reducing risk or managing risk, I'd like you to consider some of these strategic objectives. So this initial strategy is that your organization plans, designs, and builds and operates systems that are prepared for both current and future, or what oftentimes is called emerging risks. So just some really simple strategic objectives: that you're going to increase safety requirements, that you're going to be prepared for future hazards and not just known hazards. So looking ahead at what might happen, even though it's never happened to you before, and looking at the ability or your capacity to meet the increased probability of multiple hazards arising concurrently. So that's where we get to that capacity piece. You might have safety systems in place, but are they just tied to known hazards, or the ones that happen the most often? And so looking at how can you do that for looking towards the future, and also looking at if all of those things happen at the same time. And here is where it's important to not just meet basic requirements for your critical components, so your technology side of things for the most part, but that you're exceeding those basic requirements. And so designing your critical components to exceed basic reliability and durability requirements. Therefore, this is where we get to the part of being prepared versus being resilient. I don't mean versus necessarily, but this but this continuum idea that we have to at least meet the basic requirements, but that's usually minimum. And so if we're using business continuity language, since I saw a lot of you were from business continuity, are we looking at those minimum business continuity objectives versus what we want to extend beyond that, not just be minimally competent? And then looking at those interdependencies. Obviously, the business impact analysis is a really good way to do that. Some risk assessments do something similar, but I think the business impact analysis, if done correctly, really does a nice job of looking at interdependencies, especially if you're looking at the supply chain. We all know that the world of supply chain has changed, and I'll say lean has become more mean more recently, and with countries, not just organizations, but whole countries changing how they manage supply chains. And that's only going to become more complex moving forward with the tariffs that the US has put on other countries and with the reciprocals, because now all of a sudden your supply chains are becoming much, I'll just use the word mean, because we're not able to really do things the way we were doing them before, and we have to look for new ways to get our supplies in. But this is also when we're looking at different networks, IT networks as well, and really trying to avoid that risk of cascading failures, so that you might have one little break of something that you don't consider very critical, but it does break your network, and it creates that cascading failure. Another objective is to design to fail safely. This is something that IT people are very familiar with, is looking at sustaining safe conditions during disasters and disruptions, but looking at it from both the business side and your people side, as well as the technology side. So this idea that safety will take place or take priority over continuity of services. And this is something that business continuity people might question, but the question is, life safety has always been our first priority. And so how do you make sure that you're designing to fail safely, no matter whether it's a facility type of process, whether it's an IT process, or any other process that you're looking at. Also designing for multiple scales. I think this is where we talk about, things that take lasting longer and being more complex. A lot of times, looking at contingency plans. Back in the day, they were, and really you see that a lot in emergency management, which is that we're planning for a hurricane, and you're planning for some specific thing, like even workplace violence. But the fact is that a lot of times these things happen, multiple things are happening at the same time, and looking at planning for the worst case scenario is important, as well as planning for the normal scenario that you have. So planning for having multiple scales and using both preventive as well as adaptive design solutions, so that we can use this solution in many different ways versus it being tied to a specific response or a specific hazard or threat. And this idea of commitment to maintenance, I have to say that when you talk to people about, a lot of times, whether their maintenance is technology maintenance, things are skipped. And all of a sudden, you're now in a crisis because the maintenance hasn't been kept up, whether that's your information security and cybersecurity types of maintenance processes, whether it's equipment, whether it's running, the building itself, but it's also maintaining your plans. And that what you wrote a year ago might not make sense today because of the different changes that you've had. So not just committing to maintenance of your asset management, but also of all aspects of your plans and preparedness and managing risk activities. So I talked about the need we're going to look more closely at the need to break out of our silos. And this is the term that we're using, is you need to be integrated. So looking at how can you increase coordination and integration, or even if you want to use the word collaboration, that might be a word that's more friendly. But among those different functions, departments, or divisions are all the different ways that you manage risk to really improve your ability to work more effectively across those organizational boundaries that you have and to reduce that silo or stovepipe behavior. Because this is the way we often work. Everybody's kind of in their own lane, doing their own thing. You work with the same people, but in reality, all of those you're all part of the same organization. And so we need to be integrated. We need to be collaborating because each part of the organization contributes to that broader success of whatever the activity is. And here's where you go to that, to the interdependencies as well. But the ability to achieve common goals and support of the achievement of your objectives is rarely done in isolation. We're all depending on each other to make that happen. And so everybody needs to have an understanding of how your work affects others and vice versa, and understanding that we need to have effective working relationships. So this idea of cross-organizational collaboration and alignment. And I guess what I'm kind of curious about, and maybe I should have asked this question, if I was in person, I would be asking this question with examples. But this idea that as people in offices are more and more working remotely on more of a permanent basis, how is that impacting your collaboration? Is that actually something that's getting better because now that you're using technology to collaborate and communicate to run your meetings, that you're including more people because that you're not reliant on who's in the building at the time? Or is it something that's really been impacted because you don't have everyone together at the same time? And I don't say that there's a right or wrong way to do this. What I'm saying is you need to make sure that you're collaborating and that you've got this idea of integrating all of these aspects together to be more effective. When we look at how can we operate as kind of not just a framework, this is kind of a picture of a framework, but really putting those systems together, where can you start? So on the operations side, you can start by bringing together your incident response, your business continuity, your crisis management, and your supply chain at a minimum. To me, that would be the very basic way that you would start in order to increase or improve your what we would call operational resilience. We should also see technology systems being aligned, whether it's your data centers, your IT continuity programs, how you manage storage and availability, and your information cybersecurity. And this creates its own challenges all on its own. Interestingly enough, the most common reaction that I hear is that your ITDR people are even separate from your what they often call your IT people, that even that's siloed. And of course, we know that it's important for information and cybersecurity people to actually have some boundaries between them to avoid cascading failures and to really make those security systems stronger. But at some point, we have to be talking to each other so that all of our systems are working together and not separately. And then there's management systems. These are just a few, but sometimes they're really forgotten. This idea of asset management is hugely important. Your quality systems, when you're talking about food safety, for example, that's all tied to quality systems. Your financial systems and all the risk that goes with that. And then your people, your talent management or your HR people. How are you managing those and how are you making sure that there's not risk tied to those? And so ideally, all of these would be working together, just like I really started you with the I-Corps framework where we were looking at those things. But at a minimum, try to get each of these pillars working together as a starting spot. So wherever you're located, try doing your best to try to get those to work in a more collaborative manner. Because this is that alignment and that coordination is really what separates you having a resilient business continuity management system, but it's not tied to anything else. So when you're looking at an organizational resilience, I'm going to go back and look. If you're looking at an operational resilience capability and improving your capacity, you need to at least be in the operations pillar. But if you're looking at an organizational resilience capability, you should have all three of these pillars plus more working together. So let's look at some strategies to implement a systems approach. So the outcome statement would be that you have a coordinated approach for increasing preparedness and managing risks that ensures the alignment of systems and the elimination of silos that may create barriers among your functions. And so for that strategic objective of coordinating and aligning your systems, that you're going to ensure that the organization has the capability to design and develop systems to increase preparedness and manage risk, and that you're going to regularly assess how each system contributes to the overall resilience of the organization, and then address weaknesses where these are found. And then your second strategic objective would be that you'd have a unified incident response structure. And so to have that, you would increase your efficiencies, you determine common incident objectives, and achieve that joint direction. And here is where we get to some of the behaviors, that you have redundant systems. So you're not reliant on just one system to be available during a disruption. So you need to have redundant systems to increase your capacity, and trying to plan for interdependence to realize how can we internally transfer these functions to improve system redundancy as well. And this is not just a technology piece. This is also how we can better collaborate between each other in the different ways that we manage risk. But of course, we want to be prepared. So we need to have good emergency resources that we can recover rapidly, and make sure that we have plans in place. Here I'm probably preaching to the choir. I understand that. This is what you do and where you are, but it doesn't mean that it's not important as a strategic objective to call out. We also need to be resourceful. So this comes back to that capacity piece. Can we mobilize the needed resources and services when needed? Do we have what we need at hand? And are we able to really build on strategic objective 4 to do that? And number 3 as well, those redundant systems. And then looking at making sure that we're robust. So are we able to improve how we absorb the impact and how we are able to resist the impact of those threats, and being able to mitigate that spread of damage? That really, the word impact is the word I'd rather use than damage, but this idea that we need to absorb and that we need to be agile enough to move ahead and to have plans in place on how we might do that. It doesn't happen by magic, as you all know. You have to have something in place and have thought it through. So let's take a look at our second poll, which is, to what extent are the systems that manage risk mitigated at your organization under one system? And again, I'll give you about 30 seconds to do that. And I use the word enterprise risk management here because it's a common thing that's in place in many organizations, but I'll have to tell you that I have talked to people who have an enterprise risk management program, and business continuity is not part of it, and neither is crisis management or IT people. And so this is why that term, while the term itself might allude to the fact that it's organization-wide, a lot of times it keeps a lot of people out of it. So this is really, really interesting. I'm going to go ahead and close this. And we are evenly split. It's about as evenly split with the poll as you can get. So, just over 30% of you have a single framework, which is fantastic. Again, if you have things that are working, I would love for you to be able to either after the webinar, reach out and share, or be willing to talk to me, because I would love to be able to give really specific examples without sharing company information about how this looks in different organizations. But I am also really pleased to see, and you can use the questions button as well for that, but feel free to reach out. That some of you are on that road, at least a third of you, to being somewhat integrated. And what I was more expecting, I was actually expecting more of you to respond that they're not integrated at all than the number that you have. So this is actually really great to see this split more evenly. So let's look at what a unified incident response structure looks like. The idea here is that you make decisions based on an agreed incident management objectives, and that you're prepared to manage a situation when circumstances change, and you're also able to modify decisions when necessary. And as we've just said, the management of incident really demands collaboration, and this idea of integration and collaboration, it demands it. When we're looking at what would this apply to? Well, it would apply in your organization to any life safety incidents, any cyber information security incidents, supply chain, business continuity. I drew out their natural disasters because sometimes those are just its own entity. But also here looking at reputation, because your a hit on your reputation can actually cause what we would traditionally call a business interruption, but it's being caused by your reputation. And I'll give an example that was on the news yesterday, which is the Tesla piece. And Tesla's having a reputation issue, and it is not necessarily causing a business interruption, but it's certainly causing a financial impact, which could eventually cause a business interruption. And so what we need to do is build that incident response capability that can be applied to any of the functions within the organization, as well as across multiple functions, and have this incident response system be unified and operate as one system. Because we all too often have these siloed response systems. And as we know, what happens to one part of the organization is probably having an impact on a different part of your organization. And if they're responding in a different way with their own systems, it can create a crisis all in itself. So looking at this, we also know that each functional area, I'm just calling these functions right now, has its own escalation and reporting triggers. And so what we need to be able to do is look at those and how can we tie those together, and that no matter which of these functional areas is having a disruption, that they all report to this unified commander or unified team, whatever that looks like. And so you should have a point of contact or points of contact for reporting incidents. And then structure your incident response capability so that all incidents are reported directly to that designated individual or team. And of course, the size of your organization, the complexity of your organization is going to determine, the size of that. And once the extent of the incident or what the expected impact of the incident is confirmed, all relevant teams should be activated, but everyone should be aware of it. So everyone's aware and understanding that, okay, it's not impacting our part of the organization yet, but we're going to be on call and be ready in case it does escalate. And so the real issue here is that most organizations have multiple methods for reporting an incident. And those different methods might be preferable as as a result of variations in the skills of the person reporting the activity, the urgency of the incident, or the sensitivity of the incident. But basically, I'm going to use the old-fashioned words, just having a common phone number to report all types of incidents would be the first step in that. An example of this, by the way, if you haven't checked melissaagnes.com, she has some really nice, I'll call them, she's a consultant, but she provides things on her website that are free that give you some ideas. And one of them is her example of an internal escalation protocol. So you've got an incident detected, and you notify the team, and it might, that team does an initial analysis. And the question becomes, does this incident potentially exceed your risk appetite or meet an incident scenario that you've put together? If no, those appropriate departments would continue to perform responsibilities as usual, but we would continue to monitor it. And so even if it's a no, there should be some people on standby to monitor that scope to see if that scope changes. If it does meet that, then that functional team is going to assess the incident and say, does it meet our criteria for activation? If no, you continue to monitor. If yes, you're going to activate those functional teams and the plans, and everyone else gets notified. But if it doesn't meet the criteria, for activation, you continue to monitor to see if you need to respond. If yes, you jump right into that unified response structure. So this is kind of the front end of that initial piece before you jump into that unified incident response structure. I'm sure you have things like this already by functional area. So NIST, it's SP 800-61, has some really nice information about how you would use and implement this unified incident response system. And so one of the things they talk about is collecting incident-related information, that you should have a standard set of incident-related data elements to be collected for each incident, no matter where it's impacting which functional area. And this is going to help you be more effective and consistent in incident handling, but it's also going to help you with meeting applicable incident reporting requirements that you might have, whether those are regulated or not regulated. You should have some requirements for how incidents are reported. So the very first thing is the name, role, organizational unit, email, phone number, and location of the person reporting the incident. What are the incident details? If there's a physical location, what's the current status? What do you think the source or cause of the disruption is, including how it was detected or occurred? A description of the impacted. I like the word impacted better than affected, but and what incident category would you put it in based on your escalation procedures? Also looking at the time piece of this. When did the incident start? When was it detected? And when was it first reported? But oftentimes there's a gap between it started and when it was detected. And also look at prioritization factors such as impact, your recoverability, what you're guessing that will be, and what actions have already been performed. So no matter what the incident, collecting this type of information helps this to be much more collaborative. And when you're managing something that goes across the entire organization or even just parts of the organization, you've got a common way to communicate. This really ties to your risk escalation and reporting. So we need to be able to internalize and learn from these risk events. We also have to have lessons learned from failure, and be able to report problems that occur at the earliest opportunity. Also looking at risk reporting as seen as through the lens of continuous improvement and making risks themselves as visible as possible to staff. So every time you have an incident and you use this common framework, it provides you with an opportunity to report as well. And also just being able to share with other people in your organization what happened and how it might, if it had escalated, impact other parts of the organization as well. And just reviewing, were appropriate actions taken? Ideally, your near miss events would be part of the same process. And this is what I see as a big gap for most organizations is a lot of times near misses are hidden and people don't want even to report near misses because they feel like their culture, this kind of goes back to our culture of our organization, isn't one that will reward or recognize near misses as a positive thing, that look at what we did to do that and we need to learn about it. And so we need to have a risk culture that addresses the fact that we want to recognize near misses and make it part of our planning. And this comes from the Institute of Risk Management. We'll talk a little bit more about their paper. This is a paper that was also done by NIST, and it's a special publication, the SP 800-61. And this one talks about how we should share information as part of our incident communication. So here you see I've taken those same functional areas that we talked about earlier and put them in and how they would be aligned with that unified incident command. And so going back to that escalation and communication side of that and how we share information, once an incident is analyzed and prioritized, that unified incident command needs to notify the appropriate individuals so that everyone who needs to be involved will be able to play their roles. And making sure that you've got policies in place that include provisions concerning incident reporting. At a minimum, we'll talk a little bit more about this, but at a minimum, what should be reported to whom and at what time? So what kinds of status updates are you required to make? understanding that the exact reporting requirements will vary, but you need to have reporting requirements. That's the key piece and takeaway here. Because information sharing is a key element of enabling coordination across organizations. This helps us get out of our silos, is sharing information. And even the smallest organizations need to be able to share incident information with their peers and partners. And then looking at how do you perform information sharing across the whole incident response lifecycle, and not wait until the incident's over before you share it. There should be this idea of having that unified incident command is that information is being shared while it's happening so that everybody is on alert and ready in case they're needed. And this is basic information that comes from every ISO standard, every management system standard which manages risk, that you are required to document on what you're going to communicate. And so here is where you talk about communication regarding the incident may be needed depending on the nature of the organization and situation. And some organizations have legal and regulatory obligations to fulfill what they need to communicate. And it really ties into when. You can't wait. There are, you should have communication and notification thresholds or escalations. So knowing when it is and how frequently your communication needs to take place. Also with whom. No one, whether it's a board member, a shareholder, a stakeholder, anyone wants to find out through the news media that something's happening in their own organization. So understanding, and this is always part of clause 4 with every management system standard, that you've identified your interested parties and their communication needs. And this helps you decide who needs to be communicated with when and what it is that they need to know. It helps you put in place that means of communication. So determining in advance some methods, tools, and channels of communication, including alternatives, which of course will help you to communicate more effectively. And then assigning people who are, it's not just one spokesperson. You've got all sorts of people in your organization that are going to have communication requirements, and making sure that those are designated and they're points of contact for all those communications, which is part of that unified communication or response system that you're putting together. The other piece in this with the NIST also recommends is you use a common process for your scenario planning. So having some common questions that you would make sure that you've answered, no matter where you're planning a cybersecurity scenario or whether you're planning a life safety scenario. So how many incident response members would participate in handling this type of incident? So as you're looking at different scenarios for your planning, besides the incident response team, who else would be involved in handling this type of incident? Would there be any external parties that you'd have to report to? When would you need that reporting to occur? This goes back to those communication things that we just talked about. What information would you report or not report, and why? So having that all documented ahead of time. What other communications with external parties might occur? I would say that there's really nothing private anymore. So paying attention to number 4 is important. What tools and resources do you think your team will need in handling this incident? And then considering when the incident happens. So if this incident happens during times when people are all working, what would be your common response? Or what would it be if this would be an off hours type of response or a holiday type of response? And then looking at it location wise. So looking at it from, okay, if this happened at this location, this might be our response, but if it happened at a different location, this is how it would be modified. So what NIST is recommending that if you answer these 7 general questions in each of your scenario plans, that this will really help to facilitate that common planning process. And a reminder that scenarios are not contingency plans. They're to help us to think through what might happen and why, and how we might respond. And exploring those different scenarios demonstrates how incidents can impact different functions and also identifies those triggers for collaboration. So making sure that you can use that similar structure so that all plans that manage risk are integrated into a single unified incident response structure really helps to bring that that piece together. When you're looking at categorizing incidents, I always kind of like this bucket piece. Besides, it's kind of a cool picture. But just looking at, when you're categorizing different incidents, these are the incidents that would kind of belong here. These are the subsets of characteristics that would be there. And just putting those categories into place helps those responding to understand what type of incident has occurred and who might be involved in the management of it. So let's go to our final poll, which is, to what extent has your organization integrated its response processes and procedures for response? And you only have really 3 choices: that you've done it totally, that you're very similar to this approach, that you're doing this in some areas, that in systems that are working together in teams, it's working, or not at all, that you've got different response systems for each. And again, if there's something that you're doing really well, if you could just share it. It's really, really helpful for us to be able to give some concrete examples of how organizations are doing this. And a lot of the examples that I had were pre-2020, and I don't think that they're as valid today as they were then, because we have changed so much. I'm going to give you about 10 more seconds. I am really happy to see that it's happening for most of you somewhere. All right. And this is I'm kind of excited to see this, that it's happening for 67% of you in the systems that are working together in teams. And that is many. I was shocked to see 0 that nobody's doing this at all. So this idea that everybody's on this road already is very encouraging. And I really like to see the 33% that you're doing something very similar to this approach. That is good news to hear. I've talked about the Institute for Risk Management. It's a risk culture paper before, and I would recommend that you take a look at it. But I just wanted to close with this idea that you need to understand individual predisposition to risk and why it's important. And this becomes part of your risk culture. And so you have risk culture as part of your organizational culture. You've got behaviors that tie to that. You've got personal ethics that are tied to that. And then you've got that personal predisposition to risks. I'm looking at this from an individual level. And so it's really important for the organization's leadership to understand how individuals that are responsible for managing risk, what their predisposition towards risk and personal ethics are. Because we each bring to the job a unique perception. And this is why this idea of collaboration, integration, and I'll even start talking a little bit about the diversity of the people that are on these teams becomes really important, because we don't want to have personal predispositions to risk being lumped up with it, because now all of a sudden we're creating like-minded ways of thinking without getting different perspectives as well. But it is important to understand how it contributes to how they behave and make decisions regarding risk. And so we also know that every organization has its own approach to risk, which defines its risk culture. And that may or may not be successful in the successful management of risk. So like I said earlier, even if you're not allowed to report near misses, or it's not something that's encouraged, that risk culture becomes a product of the overall organization's culture because of that. So we have these different measurements where people have very low risk tolerance. And you would like probably people in your finance and investing to have that, where they're very self-disciplined, cautious, very conservative, ultra sensitive about vulnerability to risk. And they're going to fervently seek control. You want probably people that are responsible for your legal and regulatory risk to be very wary. So that looking at it from the role of the person in the organization is also important. And then you've got on the low side, both intense and prudent. They both have low risk tolerance, but on the intense side, they tend to be more edgy or anxious, that they invest passionately in people and projects, but they might be haunted by the fear of disappointment. Where on the other side, you might be more detailed and organized, systematic and conscientious. and their primary concern is to bring order to everything and eliminate risk and uncertainty as much as possible. Kind of the average people are both spontaneous and deliberate. So you have on the spontaneous sides, maybe more unpredictable, enthusiastic, and impulsive. They're attracted by the idea of spontaneity and risk, but might live to regret decisions made in haste. On the other side, you see the more analytical, investigative, calm and businesslike, more calculated, but they never go into anything unprepared. So they still have that average risk tolerance, but they look at risk in two different ways. And kind of opposite of low risk tolerance, you've got people that have high risk tolerance, both at the carefree and composed level, where the carefree people, they really seek unconventional ways of working. They relish excitement of on the fly decision making. They're really good at fast moving situations. Or on the composed side, you might see more cool-headed, self-contained people that aren't really bothered as much. And they keep their heads when others lose theirs sometimes. And then you have the adventurous, which is really the opposite of the wary. And these are people maybe you don't want to be responsible for your legal and regulatory, meeting those legal and regulatory and compliance risks, but they might be people that you want to have in product development, or you might want to have them doing some of these other things that you expect and need to have done for people that are a little bit more fearless. But the key thing to remember is, from a risk perspective, what is your risk landscape and your risk appetite by different parts of your organization? And the idea here is that whether you're a part of the board or executive team or part of human resources or talent management, that you look at your people's tolerance and their risk, ways that they look at risk and their predisposition for that as kind of an area. And I would expect people who are responsible for managing risk in whatever way that you are to be different than the people that are looking at this from a marketing perspective or an HR perspective or for an audit perspective. But regardless, you would want to see that each of these areas would have people represented in each of the risk predisposition categories, and that you don't want to see them bunched up. So here it's interesting that naturally you would see internal audit people being more prudent and deliberate and composed. You would expect that, and that very adventurous. Where on the marketing side, you're seeing people more spontaneous, carefree, and adventurous, and that would be natural. But you also want representation from everyone. And I would say you would want it to be very equally distributed on your board and executive team for sure. So to wrap up for today, to strengthen the resilience of your organization, being prepared and managing risk is an essential capability. All organizations should implement a systems approach to managing risk and really trying to reduce or eliminate all of your silos. Implementing a unified incident response system is one example of how to use a common process for managing risk and increasing preparedness. And understanding your risk culture and individual predisposition to risk is important as an aspect of strengthening your organization's overall resilience. We will share these references when you get your certificates. You can look at them in more detail. Let me just check if there were any questions that you'd like me to answer in the last couple of minutes. So there was a question that said, could you expound on the designing for multiple scales versus specific hazards? So this would be, for example, I'll use a case study that we used to run for an exercise. That a company had a party, and they were recognizing their top people in sales, and some of the people got sick after that party. And then it was found out that it was food poisoning. And then it was discovered that the food poisoning was intentional. And then it was found out that it was not only intentional, but it was part of an overall process to impact the reputation and to close the organization. And it became a criminal case. That's kind of a scale. But the other scale would be where you have some sort of a natural disaster and all of a sudden there's other things going on as well. So, you know, an earthquake then causes a fire, then causes an explosion, which, and now you've got, or a flooding because a dam breaks. Those types of things that the initial cause is something that you could handle reasonably, that you might have planned for, but then other things have happened as a result of that. Just a reminder, we do have our education and certification program for those that would like to be leaders in resilience and for managing risk throughout the organization. Next month, we'll be talking about understanding the global impact of DORA. We'll have a guest speaker. We hope you can join us. If you've missed any of our others in the webinar series, you can find those on our webinar page of our new website, as well as on our YouTube channel. And feel free to contact us to learn more. So if you want to reach out, please use that education@theicro.org email. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and we hope to see you next month.